Right, well, time for another adventure. Now this time heading out to Egypt, to Cairo for a conference. Like 100 degrees, but it's not that hot because there's a little bit of a breeze coming in. It's dry heat, like Burning Man. Oh well, here I am standing right in front of the pyramid of Khufu, where King Khufu has been laying now since 2500 before Christ. So we're talking about 4,500 years ago, where this giant pyramid, which by the way looks a lot bigger in person than it does in pictures, was built out of 2.3 million rocks, each being several tons. This is an incredible piece here to Egyptian architecture and history, which is still present. It's incredible. All right.
What? 2 left shoes? You kidding me? I got him 2 left black shoes. Must have been packing in the dark. I have to be wearing sneakers then. Yeah, that'll go very well.
All right, well, heading out to the welcome reception, going on the first day of the conference. I'm here with Am. Am is an Egyptian endodontist.
So I used to search YouTube to find videos of endodontic treatment using rotary instrumentation. One of the first results that came to me was my dear doctor videos, which were just after 2 months of watching the videos, I had to buy a rotary motor. Yes.
Well, I'm sorry if I cost you any money.
Well, please thank you so much for this grateful videos and more success and more learning from you. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's so nice of you. All right, guys, we have one more real Dendo fan here, Dr. Estra is from Egypt as well, the endodontist practicing here right from the Ain Shams University.
Yes.
Terrific. All right, morning of presentation, getting ready to get going to this talk, and of course, fully ready. One of my excellent formal shoes. All right. Good morning. We just Cairo. It's a great pleasure to be today. This is the foundation that we get over there at Endodontist. I want to thank you all for spending your time with me. So where does the aesthetic media come from? But it's a perforation, right? All of a sudden now the success rate drops down. You want to preserve the attachment apparatus. And then you've got the extraction, and then you've got the... Okay folks, let's take a quick look at this diagram and see what are the 5 types of perforations. On the upper left side you can see a normal tooth. This is the same molar where these 5 different types of perforations can occur. Now the first type is basically the first 2 are burr based and then the next 3 are file based. The first type of perforation, which is probably the most common and what most people are probably used to, is the inability to find a canal for reasons of calcification or disorientation. You end up drilling in the wrong direction, and as a result, you end up being perforating off to the side of the tooth. This can happen due to disorientation in general, or putting the rubber dam at a different angle, having a crown that doesn't quite match the shape of the underlying tooth, or restorations and misalignments that can change all of these orientation issues. So, but primarily when you get calcification or dystrophic calcification in teeth, it occurs in a crown down orientation. The coronal pulp always calcifies first, and then the apical area is probably last to calcify. When the pulp recedes, then you end up getting disoriented and you go in the wrong way. Now, a nice little trick to overcome this is, first of all, to always make a little marking as to at what point you will be able to find the root canal. After you make a marking in terms of the length that you have to go into the tooth before you nick the pulp, as soon as you end up going that deep on your burr and you're still haven't nicked the pulp, that's the time to stop and take an x-ray. Now, the best way to do that would be to take a bite wing x-ray. You may have to take the rubber dam clamp off or clamp the tooth behind the tooth you're working on if it's calcified. And then a nice little trick would be to inject a biceramic sealer, BC sealer, into the space that you have created with the burr, and then take a bite wing radiograph, and that gives you an impression of the canal the way you have prepared it. Then you take that radiograph, the bite wing radiograph that should be as parallel as possible, and project that onto where you are and get orientation that you're going to mesial or to distal. The buccolingual direction would be a little bit harder to determine, but you could do that by taking two different bite wing with a little bit of an angle so you can see where you are in that orientation. But ultimately, getting the information as you're going down is really important, and that's where the length of the burr that you use is really handy in terms of finding out how deep you should go before you should stop and take an x-ray. The second type of perforation occurs when you are perforating beyond the furcal floor, and you go deep and you're disoriented again. Instead of going mesiodistally and find the mesial or the distal canal, you are going straight down on the furcal floor and you end up perforating. These perforations don't fare very well, and it's very important to try to avoid them. Once again, having a proper length on the burr before you take a radiograph is important. Also, visualization of the quality and the character of the dentin you're dealing with is also very important. Dystrophically calcified dentin is of a different quality, characteristic, and color than normal dentin. Furthermore, furcal floor dentin is also a little bit darker than dentin you find around the tooth. So once this kind of a dentinal map that you run into is what helps you find the canals that you have otherwise missed. Now, the next type of perforation is a strip perforation. That's done mostly with an orifice opener, which is a greater taper file. And if you're not careful and you're using your orifice openers, or it could be Gay-Sklitten burrs or whatever is of a larger diameter, towards the furcation floor, then you run the chance of stripping that area by making the dentin on that area too thin. So it's important that you actually try to do anti-curvature filing, which means that your files should be kind of directed towards away from the furcation. And also the other thing is, by trying to reduce the taper of your files is another way you can reduce the chance of strip perforations. This other type, the fourth type of a perforation, is by going beyond a little bit of a curvature and going straight down and perforating anywhere from the mid-root to the apical 1/3 of the root off to the side of the tooth. And that is usually started by creating a ledge, and then not understanding that you don't really need to put too much pressure in order to bypass a ledge. Anytime you go down a root canal and you find yourself blocked, you have to understand that bypassing a block or a ledge, it's not a heavy-handed kind of work. You really need to have gentle hands throughout the entire procedure. So if you find yourself blocked, that's the time where you're going to have to use smaller files, hand files, and then pre-curve them, create a little bit of a J-hook, and try to work around it. Once you work, you find the canal again, stay in there, and enlarge it a little bit more. And then at that point, you're going to have to use some kind of a martensitic file, rotary file that could be pre-curved, and such as the control flex file, for example, and then go past that and enlarge it. Again, you can't use those austenitic files in those situations where you have a ledge. So these types of perforations can also be avoided by understanding that endodontic therapy is not a forceful motion. You're really never required to put any additional force on a file than you would need to put in order to write with a sharp pencil. So the last step of perforation, type 5, is basically the perforation past the apex. It could involve also zipping of the apex, but it is basically a function of not having good length control. So here you can avoid this type of perforation by staying true to your working length, getting a good apex locator reading, and then confirm that with a radiograph. And then having the combination, the rest of the procedure is based on you really having solid reference points and a good stopper to reference point kind of a etiquette, so that you're not back and forth and eyeing it. It's a very accurate job. You have to be within a 0.5 millimeter to 1/4 millimeter accurate every time you're doing these measurements. If you do get a perforation at this point, then all you have to do is to try to create a step a little bit further back inside the canal and use paper points, and then try to see if you can get hemostasis at some point before you can fill it. I would definitely not recommend to fill a canal if it's constantly bleeding from the apex. One of the ways you can control the bleeding is by using a little bit of epinephrine or some of the hemostatic agents, and until all the inside of the canal is cleaned and disinfected and there's external bleeding has stopped before you can obturate the tooth. If it's too much, then just place calcium hydroxide and fill it during the following visit where the bleeding has presumably stopped. In the type 1 perforation, as long as the problem is supracrestal, you can fill that like a regular carious lesion with any of the restorative materials. As soon as it becomes subcrestal, then the use of the bioceramic putty or MTA is important in terms of using bioceramic to get the most biocompatibility. And then on top of that, you could use either a glasionym or another type of a bioactive material to fill and restore the top of the perforation repair material. For furcation repairs, again, MTA or bioceramic is the key thing. I've described the putty technique where you place the putty and then on top of that you put Fuji 9 glasionomer and you fill the rest of the tooth up. For the type 3, the strip perforation, obviously best to avoid these types of perforations, but as long as you have kept the rest of the canal clean, just filling with your hydraulic condensation using the bioceramic sealer again would be probably the best way to address these types of strip perforations. So they do well in the long run. As long as everything is clean and you haven't had a lot of bacteria in the area, you've already managed to clean the root canal completely, then they should fare well. And for the type 4 type of perforation, these are probably the worst because as a result of that perforation, you've also blocked the rest of the canal. And so you haven't been able to clean the rest of the canal in the apical area, because the perforation itself could be repaired with bioceramic, but the bottom line is that in these types of cases, you also have uncleaned portions of the root canal. So these cases oftentimes end up needing apicoectomy and retrofilling, and which is why it's really important that you try to minimize their use by having gentle hand pressure and not being too rough. And then lastly, as I mentioned, the way to avoid those type of apical perforations is by really paying close attention to your working length and doing your best of making sure that you are using solid and reproducible reference points all the time.